129 appearances. That's how many times Bill Cosby sat across from Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. He joked with Carson, guest hosted in his chair, and became one of the most trusted faces in American living rooms. Decades later, he would be led out of a courtroom in handcuffs. But Cosby wasn't the only one. Over 30 years and nearly 7,000 episodes, Carson welcomed guests who would later be charged with murder, drug trafficking, date assault, and assault on a police officer. At the time, nobody watching at home had any idea what was coming. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what The Tonight Show meant during Johnny Carson's era. From 1962 to 1992, Carson hosted the most watched program in late-night television. There was no internet, no social media, no YouTube. If you wanted to know what was happening in American culture at 11:30 at night, you turned on NBC. Carson's desk was the most coveted seat in entertainment. A single appearance could launch a comedian's career overnight. Jerry Seinfeld, David Letterman, and Ellen DeGeneres all got their breaks sitting in that chair. For actors and athletes, an invitation from Carson was a stamp of legitimacy, a signal that you had arrived. But Carson's booking process wasn't about background checks. It was about entertainment value. If you were famous, if you were funny, if you had a movie or a fight or a new car to promote, you got the call. And sometimes, the people who got that call were hiding something far darker than anyone could have guessed. Bill Cosby first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1964, before he'd even landed the role on I Spy that would make him a household name. Carson liked him immediately. Cosby was charming, quick on his feet, and had a knack for long-form storytelling that made him a natural fit for late-night television. Over the next 3 decades, Cosby returned to The Tonight Show a staggering 129 times, making him one of the top 5 most frequent guests in the program's entire history. He wasn't just a guest, he was a guest host. When Carson took a vacation, Cosby sat behind the desk and ran the show himself. According to IMDb records, Cosby guest hosted and appeared as a regular guest across the program's full run from 1963 all the way through 1992. While Cosby was cracking jokes on Carson's couch, allegations against him were accumulating in private. Women had been coming forward with stories for years, but those stories stayed largely out of the public eye. It wasn't until 2014 that comedian Hannibal Buress brought the allegations back into the national conversation during a stand-up set, and the floodgates opened. In 2018, Cosby was convicted of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault against Andrea Constand, a former Temple University employee, for an assault that occurred in 2004. He was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison. The conviction was later overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2021 on procedural grounds related to a prior agreement with a previous prosecutor, but Cosby's reputation was already in ruins. As of 2024, he was still facing new civil lawsuits from additional accusers. The man who made America laugh for 30 years on Carson's stage had been, according to dozens of women, committing assaults over that same span of time. And nobody sitting in that studio audience ever knew. But Cosby wasn't the only guest hiding behind a famous face.
O.J. Simpson doesn't need much of an introduction. O.J. probably is one of the best football players that ever played this game, and last week he announced his retirement. Would you welcome O.J. Simpson? Hey.
On December 19, 1979, O.J. Simpson sat down across from Johnny Carson to promote his made-for-TV movie Goldie and the Boxer. He was relaxed, smiling, and exactly the kind of crossover celebrity Carson loved having on the show. Simpson had already transitioned from his legendary NFL career into acting and Hertz commercials, and he was a familiar face to the Tonight Show audience. Simpson had been a regular presence on television throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. His football career with the Buffalo Bills had made him one of the most recognizable athletes in America, and his pivot to Hollywood felt seamless. He appeared in films like The Towering Inferno and the Naked Gun franchise, and his charisma made him a go-to talk show guest. Then came June 12, 1994. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were found murdered outside of Nicole's Brentwood condominium. 5 days later, Simpson led police on a slow-speed chase down a Los Angeles freeway in a white Ford Bronco, watched live by an estimated 95 million viewers. It became the most famous police pursuit in American history. Carson had retired from The Tonight Show just 2 years earlier, in May of 1992. He never publicly commented on the Simpson case, but for anyone who watched Simpson laugh and joke on Carson's couch, the dissonance was staggering. Simpson was acquitted of both murders in October 1995, in what became the most watched criminal verdict in television history. A civil jury later found him liable for the wrongful deaths of both victims and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages. He would later serve 9 years in Nevada prison on unrelated armed robbery and kidnapping charges before his death in April 2024. The man who charmed Carson's audience had been, according to the civil jury's verdict, responsible for 2 brutal killings. And the Tonight Show footage of his earlier appearances became some of the most unsettling archival tape in television history. Phil Spector was one of the most important figures in the history of recorded music. His wall of sound production technique shaped the sound of the 1960s, influencing everyone from the Beach Boys to the Beatles. He produced iconic records for the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers, and by the time he sat down on Johnny Carson's couch, he was already considered a genius. Spector appeared on Carson's Tonight Show during the 1969 and 1970 season, according to production records, alongside guitarist Carlos Santana and the Rascals. At the time, he was the most celebrated producer in pop music. He had hits stacked to the ceiling and a reputation for absolute control in the studio. But people close to Spector had known for years that his behavior behind closed doors was volatile and often terrifying. There were stories of guns in recording sessions, of Spector pulling firearms on musicians who disagreed with him. Leonard Cohen reportedly said that during the recording of his 1977 album, Spector held a gun to his neck in the studio. The Ramones' Dee Dee Ramone told similar stories from the sessions of their 1980 album, End of the Century.
What are you reporting?
Hi, my name is Adrian. I'm Hugh Spector's driver. I think my boss killed somebody. Please can
On February 3, 2003, actress Lana Clarkson was found shot to death in the foyer of Spector's mansion. Spector's chauffeur told police that Spector had come out of the house holding a gun and said, "I think I killed somebody."
Now, why do you believe he may have killed somebody?
because you have a lady on the floor and he has a gun in his hand.
Okay, stay on the line. Do not hang up.
Spector claimed Clarkson had shot herself.
I don't understand what the you people is wrong with you. The gun went off accidentally.
His first trial in 2000 ended in a mistrial when the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial in 2009 ended with Spector convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. Phil Spector, the man who revolutionized the sound of pop music and sat on Carson's couch as an industry titan, died behind bars on January 16, 2021, at the age of 81. If there was one guest who treated Johnny Carson's couch like a second home, it was Robert Blake. The actor appeared on The Tonight Show repeatedly throughout the 1970s and 1980s, often promoting his hit detective series Beretta, which ran on ABC from 1975 to 1978. Blake was famous for his intense, unpredictable energy on set and in interviews, and Carson seemed to enjoy the chaos he brought to the program. Blake's relationship with The Tonight Show spanned years. He appeared in October 1975, January 1976, February 1979, 1980, and November 1985, among other dates, according to IMDb episode listings. He would talk about his craft, tell stories about his childhood as a former member of the Our Gang comedies, and occasionally go on tangents that left Carson scrambling to keep the conversation on track. What audiences didn't see was the darker side of Blake's personal life, which wouldn't become public for decades. On May 4, 2001, Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, was shot and killed while sitting in Blake's car outside a restaurant in Studio City, California. Blake told police he had gone back inside the restaurant to retrieve a handgun he'd accidentally left behind, and when he returned, he found Backley slumped in the passenger seat with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Blake was charged with her murder. His criminal trial in 2005 ended in acquittal when the jury found the prosecution's case unconvincing. But a civil jury later found Blake liable for Backley's wrongful death and ordered him to pay $30 million in damages, a judgment that effectively bankrupted him. The parallels to O.J. Simpson were impossible to ignore. Both men had been beloved television personalities. Both sat on Carson's couch as guests. Both were acquitted of murder in criminal court, but found liable in civil proceedings. And both spent the rest of their lives under a cloud of suspicion that never lifted. Blake died on March 9, 2023, at the age of 89. This one hit Carson personally. John DeLorean wasn't just a guest on The Tonight Show, he was a friend, and more importantly, he was a business partner. Johnny Carson was one of the investors who put up money for the DeLorean Motor Company, the Northern Ireland-based startup that produced the iconic DMC-12 sports car with its stainless steel body and gull-wing doors. DeLorean had been the youngest division head in General Motors history, running the Pontiac division at age 40 and overseeing the development of the GTO and the Firebird. He left GM in 1973 to build his own car company, and his celebrity connections helped bankroll the operation. Carson, along with Sammy Davis Jr. and others, invested in what DeLorean promised would be a revolutionary American sports car. The car hit the market in 1981. It looked incredible, but it also cost $25,000 at a time when the average car sold for around $10,000, and reviews were mixed at best. Sales lagged, and the company hemorrhaged money, and DeLorean grew desperate. On October 19, 1982, DeLorean was arrested in a Los Angeles hotel room after being caught on camera in an FBI sting operation, allegedly agreeing to bankroll a $24 million cocaine trafficking deal to save his failing car company. The surveillance footage showed DeLorean looking at a suitcase full of cocaine and calling it better than gold. During his trial, DeLorean's defense team argued entrapment. They contended that the FBI had manufactured the entire scheme and targeted DeLorean because of his celebrity profile. The jury agreed, and DeLorean was acquitted in August 1984. But the damage was done. His company collapsed, his investors lost their money, and Carson's investment went up in smoke. To make things even stranger, during the trial, a government informant testified that DeLorean had once bragged about participating in a drug trafficking scheme with Johnny Carson himself. Carson's attorney immediately called the claim totally false, and no evidence ever supported it. But for a brief moment, Carson's name was dragged into the mess alongside the man he'd once trusted with his money. DeLorean died in 2005, the same year as Carson, his legacy forever split between the brilliance of his engineering and the spectacle of his downfall. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. In that time, he sat across from nearly every major figure in American public life: presidents, astronauts, comedians, athletes, musicians, actors. He gave people their first shot at fame and made household names out of unknowns. His desk was the closest thing American television had to a national campfire. But fame has never been a reliable indicator of character. The same couch that launched Jerry Seinfeld's career also hosted Bill Cosby. The same audience that laughed along with Robert Blake's Beretta stories later watched his murder trial on cable news. Phil Spector brought the wall of sound to Carson's stage, and decades later, he died in a prison cell for killing a woman in his home. Carson himself never commented publicly on most of these cases. He was famously private, and after his retirement in 1992, he rarely made public appearances of any kind. He died in January 2005, long before many of these stories reached their final chapters. What makes these stories so unsettling isn't the crimes themselves, it's the footage, because unlike most criminal cases, there is a visual record of these people at the peak of their charm, sitting under studio lights, making millions of Americans laugh and clap along. The camera captured the performance. It just couldn't capture what was happening off-screen. And that might be the most uncomfortable truth about the Carson era. Not that criminals sat on his couch, but that nobody could tell the difference.